Wieder.
It's got it. It's going. Okay, well, I'm going to formally start the National Parks Association Southern Sydney branch meeting. Acknowledge that we're on various Indigenous lands and I'm using that term so that Darryl can recognise the Indigenous peoples of Kuala Lumpur if he likes. I'm on Darryl land here. I believe you're on Darug land over there, Lydia.
Uh,
And there are
Digital.
people all Bidjigal in your case, okay.
Yeah.
And in right up to see Brunswick Heads at this stage.
Arakwal. We're in Arakwal, Bundjalung country.
Yeah, that's right, Bundjalung country, which is
Yeah.
fantastic.
Mm.
Um, National Parks Association, as everybody probably knows, except maybe Darryl, is a conservation group dedicated to the campaigning for new national parks and or the protected areas generally, as well as making sure that once they are set aside under legislation, that they are managed appropriately. And with that, we also run an educational program, including lots and lots of bushwalks and things such as this talk tonight. And it's with great pleasure that Lydia mentioned Darryl's name as a potential guest, because I actually had fallen in love with his work a long time ago. And I'm sure he will get around to talking about his original work with magpies, Australian magpies, and the various wonderful behaviours that they have, as well as those curlews and what in the hell they're doing in the middle of Vulture Street, which, by the way, is right next to the Queensland cricket ground. Darryl, it's great to have you here, and it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Brian, and everybody else there. It's an
And
incredible
sorry,
honour.
I should have given some starting stuff there. Once we've started this now, could you put yourself on mute? I too will do that and make sure that if you've got any questions, just put them in chat and I'll keep an eye on that for later on. And if they're urgent, I will interrupt Darryl. If not, we will do them at the end, if that's okay. Yep. All right. Sorry, Darryl. Over to you now. Hello.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, got you.
Okay. Thanks for the honour of being able to present to talk to you today. This is going to kind of be a bit of a summary of the things that I've learned over 30 or odd years about urban ecology. I guess I'm a pioneering urban ecologist because mostly people didn't take any notice of the urban environment back in the day. And it was just regarded, when I got taught, and this is mentioned in Curlers and Vulture Street, I was told, basically told, if you want to study nature, you have to go away from where people are influencing them. And so that means go to the furthest away you possibly can. We now know that humans influence animals and the biodiversity wherever they are. There's, the middle of Antarctica is going to be influenced by humans to some extent. And in fact, cities are actual ecosystems in their own right. And so any of the animals that can cope with what we throw at them and live successfully in the suburban environment where we live deserve some attention. And that's what I've been doing for the last 30 or so years. And a lot of that stuff is summarised in my memoir, which has been mentioned already, Curlers and Vulture Street. But I've got another book out, and I'll mention that a bit later on. So I want to go through just some of the basic things that we've learned over the last little while, and to kind of maybe get everybody to think a little bit more about these really familiar birds. The birds that I'm going to talk about today are really not everybody's favourite birds. There's brush turkeys and crows and ibis and all the sorts of things that people love to hate. But they're the birds that have done bloody well. And so we're trying to work out, why is it that they've been doing so well and other ones aren't? So that's where we're going. So we'll just have to I'll just have to ask Brian, is it to advance the thing for me each time? There we go. So this is what we'd expect. If you were anywhere else in the world and you said, what are the birds that live in the city of wherever you are? They're going to be little seed eaters or pigeons or something like that. They'll be the sorts of birds that come to feeders in lots of places around the world, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, put out feeders. And that's another topic that I'm not going to get into, but it's another topic I've written 2 books about, but it'll take us forever to get onto that, but we're not going to touch that at the moment. But this is just to tell you what, typical birds are. There's chickadees from America, there's blue tits from Europe, and there's pigeons that are from absolutely everywhere. They're all seed eaters, they're all generalists, they're all small. They're the typical birds that you would expect to find in a city anywhere. And then you come to Australia and something crazy happens. Next one. And this is just the latest crazy thing. I mean, this is not what you would call or expect of an urban bird. This is a strange, large wading bird that's doing incredibly well in the suburbs of Brisbane, everywhere, all over the place. Every scrap of parkland or even just some crappy bit of weed-infested stuff right next to a busy road now has a pair of stone curlews successfully raising chicks. It seems to be impossible. And it's also incredibly unusual that this strange bird is the one that's doing so well. And so that's why, next one, please, Brian. That's why I've called the book, the memoir, and it kind of focuses on what I'm talking about now. What I want people to go is, if you know Vulture Street, it's not a rainforest. It's a awful big busy road right smack bang in the middle of a large city. And so to ask the question, what on earth are curlews, or stone curlews as they are, what are stone curlews doing in Vulture Street? How is that even possible? That's what my point is with that title. And so there's not a lot of the things are summarised in there. So let's start this process now. Next one, please, Brian. This is going to be how we get to the animals first. Now, that's not an actual photograph, but it's the idea is that it gives you an impression of the catastrophic nature of building cities. When we build a town or a city or a suburb or whatever it might do, the usual thing we do is get rid of everything that was there that's natural. It's ground zero. It's scrape away everything that's there and start again. And that means putting down roads and grass, lawn and everything else, obliterating the natural that was there and then starting again. And eventually it will turn into something that resembles a new type of landscape, but it won't be anything like the original. Now, the only times that that's not the case is where some cities that are a bit more far-sighted than others will allow some areas of the natural bush to remain. And those places, those areas of natural environment, and around Sydney there you've got Royal National Park and Coringa Chase and all the other national parks that are not that far away, and various other conservation areas around Sydney. That's not the sole reason, it's the primary reason that Sydney has a lot of native animals living in it, because the majority of the biodiversity still lives in those natural areas. A lot of those animals will come out and visit us in the suburbs, but many of them will, the only reason they're there is because of those large tracts of original forest. They're really crucial. Okay, next one, please, Brian. And it's really worth saying this, in no uncertain terms, is that the majority of species that are living in that natural area will not survive. They won't just move. A lot of people say, oh, well, it's a pity, but they'll just go over to the nearest bit of bush. No, the nearest bit of bush is a remnant that's left. It will be already overpopulated with other refugees from whatever bush was nearby. It will be full. The horrible, uncomfortable reality is that the majority of the animals that lived in the area before it became a suburb will just simply die. There's no way around saying it. It's been estimated that for all vertebrates, about 114,000 individual animals die for every square kilometre of urbanised land in process. And so the range of species on the screen are the kinds of ones which are most vulnerable. The little birds like the golden whistler, the smaller mammals that live on the ground, the natives like bandicoots and antechinus and all those sorts of things, reptiles and frogs that are on the ground, gliders, which are specialised, marsupials. They're the representatives of the groups that are most vulnerable and can't cope really that well with urbanisation. They vanish. At the stage when we first build a new suburb, the biodiversity plummets. It goes right down to almost zero. And then what happens slowly thereafter is the gardens grow and the trees grow and everything starts to develop. And eventually, perhaps 20, 30 years later, you have something that resembles some sort of environment that's got natural habitat and places where animals can live. And so there's a slow then filtering of certain species back in. But the crucial thing to tell you is most animals don't survive that process. Now, I've been interested mostly in why some do, and we're going to talk about them now. Let's go to the next one, please. So this is just a bit of urban ecology 101, if you like, and it just tries to make the point, probably the most general point I can make, is that when we build cities, we homogenize the biodiversity that's there. And as an extreme example, this is just I've made this up just for the point to illustrate something. On one side, you've got some northern hemisphere forest, and on the other side, a city that happens to be Rome at the moment. And here's all the birds that potentially, this is not from that space, but this is the point. A whole lot of species live there, lots of different things doing all sorts of things, live in that natural environment. Whereas in the city, next one, the biodiversity is as low as you can get, just pigeons pretty much. That's all you'll get in the middle of Rome. So this makes the point that cities dramatically homogenize biodiversity, and there's two principles that we can come up with in the process of urbanisation. Next one. Two things that happen when it comes to biodiversity. We have a greater abundance of animals, so we get millions of pigeons, for example, or starlings or whatever it might be, but most pigeons especially because they're everywhere. But we get less diversity. And this is way down the track after whatever animals were there have which ones can cope have returned to the landscape where their ancestors used to be and are trying to make it there now. So there's a lot of animals there, but there's much less diversity. And that's part of what urban ecologists are trying to do, is understand this and then trying to reverse it. How can we increase biodiversity? But let's talk about some of the animals that I've been studying for a while now. Let's go to that, please. So here's the big question, and there's a bunch of pigeons as usual. So there's the least amount of biodiversity you can imagine, bunch of pigeons in the middle of town. But why are they able to cope when all the other species can't? And so that's the question. All the species I'm about to talk about will be the ones that have survived and what you need to do. So what characteristics are required in order to make it in the big city? And when I mean big city, I don't mean downtown. I mean, there's pigeons are going to be down in the CBD. I'm actually talking about the most important habitat in cities anywhere is the sprawling suburbs. The older they are, the better they are because they've been around for a lot longer. The house blocks are bigger. There's more likely to be parks. Whereas we go into some of the shocking new habitats, new residential areas that are being built in the big cities around Brisbane and around Australia, there's hardly space for a rose bush between the trees. The house blocks are tiny. There's hardly any parks. It's just shocking. Those places will never have much biodiversity at all. But let's go and let's think about some of the animals that are doing well and find out why. So I'm illustrating this with some general principles. And here's what you need. So what do you need to make it in the big city? Firstly, next one. You need to habituate to the presence of people. This is probably as fundamental as you can get. So this is the process. Habituation is a psychological term. It's used for when people, and it happens all. It's an absolutely crucial thing that we are able to habituate, because it's if you reacted to every stimulus, you just go mad because you'd never be able to cope with what's going on. We no longer listen or hear the traffic noise outside. We don't hear the hum of everybody talking in the background when we're in a cafe. If we heard and responded to every stimulant that was around there, we would never be able to function. So it's really important and crucial for anything to get on is to learn how to turn off your being stimulated by the presence of a stimulus. Now, in the case of all these animals that we're dealing with, that stimulus is the presence of people, simply presence of people. Now, look, it's a really good thing to do to be worried about people. They're more likely to eat you and hunt you or chase you away. It's a good, sensible survival technique to be able to make sure that you don't get used to people and don't get too close to them. However, if you're living in the city, you might have noticed there are people absolutely everywhere. A city is where people live. And so in order to take advantage of the many opportunities that there are in towns and cities, you simply have to habituate to the presence of people. Don't react to them any longer. Lose all your fear. Now, that's different to actually being attracted to them, because that's a different thing. This is simply stop worrying and even thinking about them. And you can think about magpies that just don't even hardly get out of the way as you walk past them and all that sort of thing. So next one, please, Brian. I've got a couple of points to make here. What's happened is all the birds, all the animals, anything that lives in the city with us, a fundamental characteristic they have is that they no longer take any notice of people. You can just walk right past them. They don't have any more fear of them. One of the things that we did a lot of work on and continues to work on is how to quantify that whole process of how can you prove that the animal's becoming habituated. Now, and so we did work on magpies. It was mentioned already that I studied magpies for a long time. This particular study was about habituation, and there's a very simple but very reliable way to do this, and that's called the flight initiation distance. And the simplest version of it is you have an animal that you see way up ahead of you, and you walk towards the animal and you record a whole lot of things that are going to happen. When does the animal first notice you? When does it move away because you're coming clear to it? And then finally, when does it fly away? And that's the flight initiation distance. And so we compared that, and this might surprise you when you realise just how tame magpies are wherever they live, is magpies away from cities are incredibly shy. You can't get anywhere near them. And so we did a kind of a survey where we went right out west in Queensland, right out to far beyond where most people live, to really the outback areas. And we did the flight initiation distance to them. And that's simply walk towards them and note when they fly away. We did that, and then in farms closer to the city, and then outer suburbs, and then right in the inner suburbs. And there was an absolutely dramatic difference. Way out west, the closest you could get to the average close distance you could get to a magpie was 250 metres. 250 metres. They would notice you wherever you were, and they'd watch you, and if you even walk towards them from that distance away, they'd simply fly away. They didn't want to have anything to do with us. Those birds have not lost their fear of humans. That's for sure. But when we skip all the way, don't need to know all the data, but when we get down to in a city somewhere, like a suburb a couple of kilometres from downtown, the average flight initiation distance was half a metre. I mean, they just stood there, and when you walk up to them, they're going, what are you trying to do? What's happening? So they've totally lost their fear, and that's a really simple way to do it. So that's a fundamental one. You don't make it in the city unless you lose your fear of people, first thing. Okay, next one. And this is an important one as well. So here is a couple of well-known characters. Bin chicken, there's a common white ibis in a bin, stealing stuff from a bin. And there's its very close cousin, the straw-necked ibis. In almost every possible ecological way, these are identical species. They don't look the same, but they have the same background. They have the same evolutionary background. They eat the same sorts of natural food most of the time. So we did a big study on comparing how many types of ways that they find their food. Now, that big beak does all sorts of things. It can probe deeply down into the mud in the mud flats, or beside the rivers or something. It can catch grubs and caterpillars and things from grassland, and they often, both of these species are well known for going out and into places where there's a grasshopper plague and absolutely feasting on them. It can use it for all sorts of things. So we compared how many foraging behaviours, specifically for getting food, did the straw-necked ibis have, and press the button now, please, and you'll see that it says 7. So there are 7 foraging actions that we found that straw-necked ibis had wherever they lived, and we compared that to white ibis living in town. Next one, please. And there is more than double the number of foraging actions. So your bin chicken has learned how to extract chips from a bin, how to race after a toddler and steal its sandwich, how to get the meat out of a hamburger that's been discarded. None of these things did it ever have to know in its entire evolutionary history. But this is a good example of how to be successful in the suburban environment. Now, you'll see straw-necked ibis wandering around the suburbs, but they're not changing their behaviours at all. They are simply doing what they've always done. And so they're eating grasshoppers in the grass fields and probing in the mud along the rivers, but they're not stealing sandwiches from kids or anything like that. So in this particular case, this close relative has displayed tremendous behavioural plasticity, and it can change and do and learn new things so it can get access to different sorts of food. So that's the second thing. Next one, please. This is a little bit of the same thing, but this is completely different. So it's not just adapting a different, what you already do, using a beak in a certain way. This is also a completely different thing. Now, not all the birds that are successful in cities do this, but some of the most successful ones are innovative. They learn and they try and they adapt completely new ways of finding food. Now, the cockatoos, you'll be aware of this, I'm sure, and some of you may even have experienced this, and we can talk about it later if you have, that the sulphur-crested cockatoos that live in Brisbane, we don't know who started it, where he was or what was going on, but it's believed that one particular very smart cockatoo figured out a way to get access to all the possible food inside wheelie bins. And so, and that then spread. And so there's been an arms race ever since of humans versus the cockatoos, who can come up with a way to keep the lid on your wheelie bin when you put it out at night for the garbage bloke in the morning. And so there's an ongoing war going on, an arms race. And so far, the sulphur-crested cockatoos are winning by a mile. They know how to bump off a brick from the top of the thing. The most recent one I saw was somebody who they thought they were pretty clever. And they thought, we've got this guy. And there were probably 12 bungee cords stretched in every direction across the top of the wheelie bin. And this guy the human looked really smug, and he wheeled his bin out and just went, I've got this. There's no way they're going to be able to get in there. Now, another question is, where he had to take them off eventually for the garbage truck. Anyway, that's a different story. But what happened was he takes a picture, he walks away, he's still filming his bin, pretty smug, reckons he's got it sorted. A sulphur-crested cockatoo lands on the bin, looks down and goes, oh, I see, and goes snip, 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 snip. All the bungee cords fall off, opens the lid. It probably took a minute and a half for him to completely demolish that poor bloke's thing. There's no picture of him. He didn't show a picture of his face, but I can imagine what it looked like. So that's another example. So I think the next picture that is simply a picture of one of these very smart cockatoos opening a bin. And they are learning from each other. there's a group of people based at Sydney University, and they have scholars who come from Germany who are animal behaviour specialists, and they're studying the spread of this behaviour as it moves through Brisbane and through Sydney. And it seems that the birds who do it properly want to share this skill because it often takes at least two animals to cooperate and get the bin up. Because what that bird there can't actually do anything now. It needs another one to prop it up, hold it there, and while they extract the stuff from the bin. So it's really fascinating. And it's happening, like this is a thing going on right now. It's actually an evolutionary process happening. And it'll be, I talk about this later, and I've written a couple of things about this. There is really strong evidence now all around the world that certain species that are very successful in urban areas are starting to diverge their behaviour and their whatever they do so much that they're going to be regarded as separate species eventually. Some have already been declared subspecies, the urban version of whatever it might be. And this, we might have the urban cockatoo eventually, which is very different. It does different things, eats different things, sounds different, behaves differently than its country cousins. But that's something that might happen in the future. All right, next one, please. This one goes along with the same story, and it's be opportunistic. So again, when you turn up in a new landscape, a completely new place, like a city, it's very different. Now, there's a bunch of galahs that now live in Brisbane, and this has always happened. Every time there's been a very severe, prolonged drought in the west, all sorts of birds, but especially the large grain-eating birds, especially parrots, move towards the coast where it's less dry, and they come to the coast. They try and make a living out of it while they're there, but eventually things continue to improve, and then they drift back towards the inland again. And that's the galahs, sulphur-crest cockatoos, cockatiels, corellas, all those sorts of birds, lots of other species as well, and pigeons as well. Lots of the grain-eating pigeons have come to the city. But now the new city that's the way we operate our cities now is, and there's lots of feeders, lots of food, lots of native plants which they can eat. There is a significant number of the birds that moved to the coast, and those ones went to the city, didn't go back to where they came from in the west. They stayed in, became city birds. And so here, and I'm thinking particularly about the cockatoos. Galahs are a form of cockatoo. Next one, please, Brian. And it's we already mentioned this, but yes, taking advantage of new resources which are available in the city that weren't available elsewhere. Next one, please. And this is a group of long-billed corellas, which are one of the cockatoos that are doing very well in urban environments. They are big, social, smart birds, and they have learned that there's excellent food to be had on sporting fields all over the place. And so they're digging up the corms, the little bits of where the grass grows underneath the soil, and they're causing all sorts of damage to sporting fields. And they're not making themselves very, very popular, but they don't care. They found a new resource that they're taking advantage of, a resource that they didn't know about until they got to the city, and then they discovered they can do it. So they needed a different way of feeding. So they were opportunistic. They went, there's a new resource here. Let's be innovative, use a different method to to extract that stuff. We've never had to do it in the past. We can do it now, and we'll take advantage of it and breed and stay and have a great time living in the city. So that's another one. Be opportunistic. Next one, please. So this is just a slide that comes from BirdLife Australia, and it's to remind you, probably all of you have contributed to this, but every year there's the top, the big backyard bird count. And this is just the latest one. These are the birds that are the top birds for the whole of Australia. And so you see rainbow lorikeets are there as number one, noisy miners. So none of these are going to be a surprise. I pointed out because, and this is for all of Australia, so it includes Hobart and Darwin and Perth, not just Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane. What I want to point out to you is number 6, the house sparrow. When I started being an urban ecologist in the 80s, and my first study was of the birds that lived in my hometown of Wagga Wagga, like everywhere else, virtually around the world, I didn't need to know, no one needed to tell me what the commonest bird in town was. It was always the house sparrow. Every study that had ever been done around the world said the same thing. The house sparrow is absolutely the commonest urban bird anywhere, in any city, just about in the world. And that's really interesting because it ain't no longer the case. And what we were thought, what everybody worried about in those days was that the sparrows, starlings, miners, spotted doves, and all the other introduced birds were just going to slowly take over. And so that the urban birds would be just pushed out, and the only thing that would be left would be all these exotic birds that were introduced to Australia. And that didn't happen. It did happen in other places in the world, but it didn't happen in Australia, and it appears to be because we've still got plenty of native habitat. So that's a really extraordinary thing that didn't happen, that I was one of them who predicted that we'd be completely surrounded by introduced birds and all the natives would just vanish. Not the case. So we're going to now look at two things, the house sparrow and the rainbow lorikeet, and see how different they are. Next one, please, Brian. So this is data that could be from anywhere, but it happens to be from Canberra, and it shows the mixed fortunes of two species. So the reddish line that goes down and the bluish one that goes up, they're the two species on the screen. So the reddish line is the house sparrows. So this is about 20, 30 years or so of numbers that they did every year, very detailed numbers throughout Canberra. And you'll see the steady decline. And that has continued on. That finishes, I think, in something like 1998 or something like that. So it's a bit pretty old, but the trend is exactly the same. So as the numbers of house sparrows vanishes and goes down and down and down, the numbers of rainbow lorikeets is literally exponential. It's just going. It's almost vertical now, and we have to ask the question why. So let's just talk about the house sparrow first. I'm sure you're all aware of the house sparrow, and I'm sure you're all aware that it seems to have gone from just about everywhere you can go. Next one, please, Brian. Yeah, so here's our house sparrow. Once the commonest, well, it was regarded as the most abundant and widespread species on the planet of birds. So next one, there's a map comes up. And this shows you the distribution of the bird now. So the dark maroon colour is where it normally, its natural range. So it's all of Europe and most of Asia, right across to all the way to the eastern area of Asia. But that bright red colour, so Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, South America, and all of North America, that's where it is now. It's been introduced to those places where the British Empire, you can pretty much, remember the pink bits on the map, the World Atlas. The pink bits are where the birds went, because our British forebears, for those of us who have British extract, they took these birds with them. The amazing thing about the house sparrow is that they were taken all around the world, not for economic reasons or anything else, but for nostalgic reasons. They reminded people of what it sounded like to be in a European city. It was the sound, the chirping of the sparrows was so familiar, so nice. They said, can't we have some sparrows? And they took them all around the world. Now, thankfully, the sparrows haven't become a horrible nuisance. They're a bit of a problem in some places in terms of getting into horticulture and causing damage there. But they pretty much have stayed in towns. Now, there are places in the northern, in Western New South Wales and around those sorts of places where you can still see plenty of them. They're always in the wheat growing areas. They have managed to live on the spilt wheat from the wheat crops. But basically, they are pure stay-at-home city birds that haven't infiltrated the bush at all. So that's the house sparrow. The question is why? Why are they disappearing? Still pretty much unknown. But I mean, the origins of the house sparrow were lots of them that were brought to Australia were captured in the streets of London. That's where they were. They were so common. They were the bird that everybody knew about. And now in London, they are regarded as an endangered species. In London, house sparrows in London, unbelievable. You can't see them. They're just about gone. So that's extraordinary. And lots of studies been looking at it. One that seems to be particularly strong in terms of an explanation is that although house sparrows live exclusively on seed, like virtually every other bird, the babies don't get raised on seed. They can't cope with the seed. They need lots of protein, and that protein is in the form of insects. And it seems that there's as you probably have heard, there's a tremendous decline in the number of insects around the place. And that in cities is especially bad, and that's been attributed to the fumes from unleaded petrol. Unleaded petrol, we now know, stops the development of insect larvae. It stops it before they actually emerge, and they never become adults. And so there's been a crash of the abundance of insects, and that's baby food for sparrows and a lot of other birds. And that seems to be the main reason that they've vanished. There's lots of other reasons as well, but we won't go into those too much. So that's the demise of the house sparrow, as opposed to the next one, the rise of the rainbow lorikeet. And it's probably no mystery to any of you in this audience why the rainbow lorikeet is doing so well. It literally now is absolutely the most common bird in every capital city in Australia, including Perth, where it was introduced. So it's an introduced bird in Australia, and it's now the commonest bird there. Why? Sugar, nectar, pollen. We've planted, as we all thought was a fantastic idea when during the 80s or so, when it was discovered that there was actually beautiful native plants that we could put in our gardens, and we stopped putting just gladiolas and rose bushes in our gardens and started to use native plants like callistemons and grevilleas and banksias and melaleucas and all those sorts of things, all of which were bred and have very showy flowers, which look beautiful, and they are an incredible source of nectar and pollen. And so what happened there was the birds that said, we really like nectar and pollen, went absolutely brilliant, give us more. And so now we've got rainbow lorikeets coming out of our ears, as well as, of course, noisy miners, the honey eater. So next one, please. And there's some unintended consequences. You might think that's a good thing, but there's all sorts of reasons for this. Rainbow lorikeets are aggressive. They're absolutely gorgeous looking things, but they're aggressive to all sorts of other birds, and they're outcompeting many other species for the hollows that they all need to breed in. And that includes the scaly-breasted lorikeet. And that's a smaller bird. It's a very inoffensive bird. It never picks on anybody else, whereas rainbow lorikeets will beat up anybody. And now, from having been the commonest lorikeet in Brisbane, it's now vanishing fast directly as a result of competition with the rainbow lorikeets. And that was we didn't know that. We didn't expect putting in native plants in our gardens would have such a profound and negative effect. Rainbow lorikeets especially, but much more important is noisy miners. I don't need to tell you about how crucial noisy miners are. They are driving the biodiversity crisis in Australian cities, and that remains probably our biggest challenge of all. Next one, please. Now I'm going to finish up with a couple of points. So these are points about strategies. So to go back now to a principle of why certain birds are making it. You will recognise that bird. It's the peregrine falcon, of course, you all knew that. Next one, please. And so this first strategy, there are two basic strategies that successful birds apply. And one is if you're a real specialist and you can apply that speciality to the urban environment, do so. So you will also probably be aware that the peregrine falcon almost went extinct during the 60s and 70s as a result of the spread of DDT, a pesticide that and because they're the hot peak of the food chain, they spray it for insects, they eat the insects, and that would accumulate in the tissues of the predators, like peregrine falcons. And the problem with the birds of prey was it made their eggshells thin. And so when they would sit down to incubate their eggs, they would just break. And so they almost went extinct until DDT was pretty much banned internationally. Skip forward about 3 or 4 generations, 3 or 4 decades. Next one, please. And the most dense population of peregrine falcons is in New York City. New York City. And that's because peregrine falcons have always been specialists. They've been cliff dwellers that put their nests high up on cliffs with a big view outside, and they specialise on pigeons. Now, a city couldn't be more well adapted to a peregrine falcon. They've already got the cliffs, the skyscrapers. You can put nests up there. It's so dense, and all of these cities are full of fat, lazy pigeons waiting to be eaten. And so every city just about in the world now has got its own population, or at least a few pairs of peregrine falcons, doing very well, thank you very much. So that's a principle. Let's see if it applies to any birds in Australia, and see how that works. Next one. Now, this is a bird you probably won't recognise. I can hear the laughter in the background already. So this is the bird that I did my PhD on. The reason I left and went from New South Wales to Sydney, to Brisbane, and that was to study the brush turkey's ecology. And when I got there in the early 80s, there was none, absolutely none in town. Why would a bird like this be in town? And I had to go and find a population right up in the mountains, in the rainforest where they normally live. And I studied their natural habits when up in the rainforest. Now, over the next 10 years, I just happened to be the right person at the right time. This bird, this specialised rainforest bird that builds an incubation mound out of organic matter, started to moving into Sydney, into the suburbs of Brisbane from the west. It was almost hunted to extinction as a game bird, and it was shot by everybody and sundry until there were almost none left. But there's just little pockets of them survived, way up in secret locations, way up, high up in the mountains somewhere. And they slowly, when all the native birds in Australia were protected by law in 1972, the populations of these birds that were shot all the time slowly started to recover. Eventually, some of them moved back into the western suburbs of Brisbane, where lots of people had rainforest backyards, more or less, and they planted rainforest trees. It was the right climate. All those sorts of things grew. And a rainforest bird, the brush turkey, said, hey, I can live here too. I can make a mound in your backyard. And they moved in. And it took a while, but eventually they just grew and grew and grew, and the populations took over. And the same thing has happened all over Australia and is currently going on. Well, it's been going on for a while now in Sydney, as you probably all know. This bird is taking over. It's reclaiming its distribution almost completely, from almost being extinct through our efforts to coming back. So another completely bizarre bird that you would never have expected to do well in the city. Next one, please. So here's a mound. This is a giant mound, a ridiculously too big mound, but that's like an enormous amount of material that brush turkey has gathered. And I can tell you straight away that bird is an unsuccessful male. The reason they build an incubation mound, which can be weigh as much as a car, that weighs as much as a truck. The optimal size is 1.5 meters high and about 5 meters across. That's probably 10 times bigger than it needs to be. And that tells me, I know immediately what's going on there. This guy has built a mound in a place where there are no females. He's gone somewhere and said, I'm going to try my luck here. He's got all the materials he needs. He builds a giant mound and no females come, and he builds a bit more and no females come. And at the end of the breeding season, he's got the giant, absolutely unwieldy mountain of material, and still no females have come. So you kind of be a little bit sorry for him, because he's not going to be successful. And that's one of the problems. He relies on the females to find him. The males build a mound that's an incubator, and the females need the incubators in order to put their eggs in there. They literally abandon their eggs at the bottom of a pile of a compost heap and walk away, and there's nobody looks after them. Next one, please. And so probably the most ridiculous and unexpected thing about brush turkeys and all megapodes, there's 22 species of them that all build mounds like this, is that there is absolutely no parental care. When this chick hatches, it's a metre down in a pile of dirt. It spends its first two days of life digging its way to the surface. And then when it arrives at the surface, there is nobody to protect it, nobody to tell it what food is appropriate, nobody to tell it what a predator looks like, nobody tells it where to go for the night and be safe. It's alone, nobody looks after it. It's a sitting duck. 95% of them won't make it through the first week. And yet the population still continues to grow. So it's doing bloody well, and we're not entirely sure why. But this loss of parental care is an extraordinary thing, and it's been studied by lots of students of mine over the years. But it's a remarkable thing. So this bird that for a lot of people is simply just an appalling nuisance that builds a whole big mess in your backyard is actually really fascinating, and there's lots more to be studied about that. Okay, next one, please. So this is the second strategy. The first one was just use your specialisation. This next one is adapt to the new conditions and change your behaviour. So adapt to new things. And so here's a Teresian crow. This is the corvid that lives in Brisbane. Next one, please. In your area around Sydney, it's going to be the Australian raven, but it's the same thing. They do exactly the same thing, except that the Australian raven doesn't do what I'm about to describe. So one of the things about the Teresian crow is it lives in pairs or very small groups out in the bush where it mostly lives. It lives throughout the whole tropical part of Australia. But in the city, it forms massive roosts, huge roosts of 100 to 1,000 birds. That simply doesn't happen in the bush. It doesn't happen. It's only in the city. And we've been looking at the formation of these roosts and why they're there and all that sort of thing. And it's all down to the types of food that you can get in the city. Most of the birds that live in the city, most of the crows that live in the cities survive on discarded human food. So waste products, like, around the schools, discarded Vegemite sandwiches and all that sort of thing around the junk food areas, KFC and all those sorts of chips get tossed around. Their diet is primarily that sort of stuff. And this allows them, we don't exactly know what the mechanism, but it's always related to the availability of that kind of fast food for food. But there's something else going on as well. Next one, please. One of the things that happened just a little while ago is, and this, I can tell you this, that this happened 8 years ago. So there is a nest. That's a crow's nest. It's on a building in Brisbane. I was alerted to this because what happened was they built a new building at Griffith University in the middle of Brisbane. It's surrounded by a large area of forest, and there were lots of crows there, and all the crows, we were looking at the crows as well. They all did what crows do anyway. They nested out in the trees. And one of the problems about Brisbane is that the breeding season of the crow coincides really well with the storm season. And so what happens almost, it's something like 28% of the nests that are built every year in Brisbane get blown out of the tree with chicks in the nest or eggs in the nest. It's really a terrible mortality. And so, but they still, they always put their nests in the trees. That's what crows do. Now, there are plenty of places where crows have taken advantage of human structures, but they're just like a tree. They're just like electricity lines or those big towers or something like that. There's nothing special about them. They're structurally just a metal tree. But what's going on here is something completely different. This is a nest that's been put inside a protected area, behind a wall inside a building, and it can be seen from inside. And these birds are doing something new, completely new. They're building on a structure that's close to where people are, but they're building for a purpose that's about survival. Next one, please. Now, this new building that was built at Griffith University, and I had an office there, above me, and that has glass walls. And so what happened was this pair of crows started building a nest on the structure immediately on the other side. So it's on the outside of the building, but the walls are glass. You can see them right there. And so this bird started, there was a pair of them. We just watched them for a couple of years, and they had no idea what they were doing. They'd put some sticks down, and we thought, oh, they're trying to build a nest. This is ridiculous. What are they doing? But on the third year, they actually successfully built a nest, had eggs in it, and raised chicks. Amazing. And that was the first time that we'd ever noticed this. And I wrote somebody, because when I'm an urban ecologist and study wildlife, frequently journalists would ring me up if there's a slow news day, nothing's been going on. They say, got any wildlife stories we can just put in the paper tomorrow? And I went, oh yeah, I've got a new one. There's a bird here on my building that's built a nest, and I explained all that sort of stuff. And he wrote it up, and it was like a classic thing, boffin surprised by crows nesting on buildings or something. First time he's ever seen it, they quoted me or something. Well, I then got, as frequently happens, quite a series of emails from other people around Brisbane and southern Queensland who suggested that perhaps I needed to get out a bit more often and keep my eyes open a bit more, because exactly the same thing had happened on their building, wherever it might be, in Rockhampton or Sydney, somewhere around southern Queensland. But always on a building where the nest was protected from the weather. And I went, this is really interesting. So although the tone of those emails was not very friendly, I wrote back to all those people and said, tell me more details. And we got on to this. And it turns out that those people were fascinated to tell us about the crows that were nesting where their building was in the town and where they worked. And every week, coffee break, they'd come out and check on how the chicks were going and all this sort of thing. And it turns out that over a series of years, and it was only about a 5-year period, there had been a sudden surge in the crows building nests on buildings. And it really took off. And this is, next one, please. I think this is going to be a significant event. It's like the other things that I've mentioned about the change in fortune. This is potentially an actual evolutionary event, because that bird there, which is looking at me through the glass saying, what the hell are you doing so close to my nest? Keep away. That is not a friendly look. It's very unhappy. This photo was actually not taken at where my office was. It was the bloke above me. And he said, I can't stand the bird just peering at me, staring at me the whole time. I'm going to work from home for about 3 weeks until the chicks have all gone. So that was pretty amazing. But I think this is an evolutionary event, because what will happen is those babies that are born on those structures will think that's where you build a nest. They were completely they totally abandoned building nests on trees, and they will raise their chicks in these protected places. And we've got the data. They are already much more successful than the birds putting their nests in trees. So this is happening right now. There will be, because they'll be more successful than the other birds, there will be a genetic change in the animals. Their behaviour will change. All the urban crows in Brisbane will eventually be nesting on buildings, and they will out compete and out swamp in terms of the numbers the ones that don't. And there will be eventually all the Teresian crows that live in Brisbane will be nest builders on buildings, and they won't mate with the birds that live in trees. And that's an evolutionary event that we're kind of witnessing as we speak. Thank you. I think that's just about it. Let me have a look what's there next, please. Oh, yes. So, and we conclude with the stone curlew. Now, in New South Wales, as you probably are all aware, this bird, incredibly abundant now in Brisbane, is almost going extinct in southern parts of Australia. So what on earth is going on? This is a very unusual bird to be so abundant and successful in a big city like Brisbane. It's just amazing. What on earth is happening? Now, the primary reasons for the demise of bush stone curlews in southern Australia is two things. Habitat destruction, of course. They used to be occurring in the places which are now the best places in New South Wales and Victoria for growing wheat. And so the wheat, they just cleared all the land and now it's wheat, and there's no habitat left. and the ones that have survived are being absolutely hammered by cats and foxes. So, next one, please. So how does that, why isn't that going on? Because there are foxes everywhere in Brisbane, everywhere. Now, here's a theory. We don't know whether this is correct or not, but this bird, as I explained right at the beginning, like any other successful bird in the city, has had to completely lose its fear of people. And they don't take any notice of people. If you get too close to them, to their nest or their chicks, they put out their wings like that, rush towards you with their mouth open, making a horrible hissing noise. And those wings are like 2 meters across. This is a big, scary thing. I've seen it already. I've seen it during the day when there's been foxes. There are some foxes which you get around during the day. But these birds have no fear of foxes either. And the theory that we have is that in the process of losing their fear of people, they've also lost their fear of other predators like foxes and dogs and cats. And they will unhesitantly chase away a fox from their nest. And so that may be the reason that they are surviving in Brisbane, whereas they're not surviving in other parts of Australia, because they're everywhere. You wouldn't believe the sorts of terrible places that they're successfully breeding in Brisbane. It's extraordinary. And it's the motif of Curlew's and Vulture Street, why I chose it. Next one, please. So this is the latest book, and it's just came out late last year, and it's selling like crazy. This is the world's first field guide to the birds of urban environments. It's incredible. The whole point of it is it's not technical. It's absolutely scientific, but it's easy to read, very understandable. It only features the birds that are going to appear in people's yards or backyards or parks. It's not all the birds of Australia. It's only the birds that are found in the cities of Australia. But it works equally well in Hobart and Perth and Cairns and Canberra as it does in Sydney and Melbourne and Perth. So that's the latest book. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. And thank you, Darryl. I guess Brian wants to know if anyone's got any questions.
There have to be a million questions. Given that I am chairing this, I'm going to do the naughty thing and take the first question.
Oh, well,
there's a
okay.
bird, Darryl, that you have not talked about that intrigues me, and that's the masked lapwing, the spurwing plover.
Yep.
I have no idea how it can be nesting all over Sydney, occupying almost every nook and cranny.
Yep.
When it just lays its eggs in the middle of a field, it gets mowed by councillors or whatever, and still is managing to expand successfully.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the same. It's kind of the same story as the curlews, but they're a much smaller bird. They'd be much more likely to be vulnerable to the predators. That's for sure. I mean, we studied them for a while, but not extensively. But that still remains a great example of how on earth do they survive so well, and the places they choose to put their nests. This far from a busy road. What are the chicks? How do they get across the road? It is amazing, and yet the proof is in the pudding. They're everywhere. They're still expanding. Every schoolyard's got them. Every park seems to have them. They're amazing. Don't know the answer to why they're so successful, but they certainly are.
Well, I might ask a question if no one's else going to jump in.
Sure.
Darryl, be interested in Indian miners. You didn't seem to do too much on them. How are they getting on? And another question is, are brush turkeys affected by foxes?
No, they're not. Well, let's start with the brush turkeys. Now, brush turkeys are not affected by the foxes. There's a few places where the foxes have learned to dig up the mounds, but they're too deep. Like the eggs are a metre or more down, and that doesn't work very well. There are some goannas which have learned how to dig that far down, and they are successfully getting the eggs for sure. But the foxes are getting the babies. There's no doubt about that. When they come out, they're so vulnerable. They just perish, and nearly all get taken by cats. But your first question was, sorry, what was the
The Indian miners. Indian miners.
Oh, Indian miners, yeah. Indian miners are common miners. Yeah, no, so they're a real boogie bird. It turns out that they aren't having the impact that we always thought they would. They outcompete birds for hollows. They actually actively pierce the eggs of native birds, throw out the chicks, all that sort of stuff. But they haven't been going deep into the forest.
No.
They're staying on the edges. They're staying in the urban environments. So inner city, inner Melbourne, all those places, absolutely overrun with them. There's nothing else you can, that's there. They're just the commonest bird in downtown. But they aren't going deep into the forest, and so they're basically occurring where there's not much else there. So they're not really doing too much damage.
Thank you.
And so that's a hard thing to say, because I was involved in trying to populate, get rid of birds. There was all sorts of traps and things. They got rid of hundreds of them. But in Canberra, they got it down to, I think, about 200. They removed something like 100,000 miners from Canberra. 3 years later, the numbers were back up to the same thing. You can't. They're just too hard to control. So the good thing is that they don't seem to be having the impact we were worried about, which is, I guess, something. Yeah.
What about bellbirds? If I could just go on, I live in a region that's it's interesting. Where I live, it's sort of a little country village over the hill. We've got Stanwell Park, which has the Indian miners, but where I live, we had an influx of bellbirds for a little while, and then just disappeared. How are they going? Of course, I understand they try to crowd out other species with just the mass of them.
Yeah, that's right. So they're a little bit like the noisy miners. They're intolerant of any other smaller birds, but they're much more confined. They don't. Noisy miners, you can go into a habitat, into a forest, and there's just one colony after the other. Just all the way along. Whereas the bell miners seem to be more isolated from other populations. There's bigger gaps in between them. So there's no, little birds can't cope with them, but they, unlike the noisy miners, they almost never come down low. They stay up high in the canopy, and so the little birds can survive if there's enough structure down below, in the presence of bell miners, which they simply can't with noisy miners. But the problem with the bell miners, and this is a problem.
That's the bellbird.
The bellbird. It's the same thing, also called a bell miner. What they do is that they keep all the other birds away, because they want to. They harvest the thrips, what's it called? Honeydew that comes up. Yep. And so they actually encourage this sap-sucking insects to make the honeydew, because they love the stuff. It's sweet. And the problem with that is, because all the other little birds would have eaten those insect pests. There are places where there's all the trees, every leaf on every tree is covered in these things, which the bellbirds love, but eventually they will kill the trees. And so there are whole valleys where all the trees have died because of the bell miners, sort of harvesting and farming these insects. Now, eventually, in the long term, the miners will, the trees will die, and the bell miners will move on, and it will recover. But it might be 100 years in the process of doing that. So, yeah.
Questions, folks?
Oh, I have a question, Darryl. Another question. Yes. About small birds. What are the studies have done about them currently, like those small bush birds, silver eyes, spotted pardalots, red-browed finches, and all these species? How are their situation at the moment around Australia? And
almost all of those birds are in serious decline. Again, because of habitat, less so because of predators, but the cats are having a bad impact on them. Now, it's mostly about habitat, and that's one of the problems as climate change advances, it seems to be affecting the lower shrubs more than the trees. And so again, we've already talked about this a number of times here. That lower layer of dense impact, high density shrubbery is crucial to the survival of those birds, to keep away from predators and just to keep away from each other. And so as that declines, it's going to be really bad. So what we need is drought-resistant native shrubs as much as possible in as many places as we can. That's really crucial. That's one of the first important things that we need to do wherever there's little birds that are going missing. And there's been some really good experiments done around Melbourne, where they've put in the shrubs, and 2 years later, most of the birds that were gone have returned. Not all of them, because once they've gone completely, they can't return. But at least they've recovered because of the presence. The main thing was the availability of these long, deep areas of thickety stuff that they could hide in. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Can small birds survive in Westringia, Darryl? Would you know?
I don't know too much about that. I don't remember. No.
I tend not to see. I do actually see them. I do actually see them in the lantana, as you suggested.
Yeah.
And,
well, in fact, I was surprised. A bloke who did his PhD with me concluded about the biodiversity of butterflies. Was he said the single most, he went all over the place and worked out why what the biodiversity of butterflies were. And the thing that he found and nobody wanted to listen to or even acknowledge, he said that single most important thing was the presence of lantana. It was just really important for the butterflies, and so that's a weed, how can you possibly say that? But it was true. Yeah.
Well, Lydia needs to grow a lot of that.
We used to have a lot of that, but now we still have some. Yeah.
Tim
the other thing is that
Tim was quite specific about the connection between lantana and the survival of the species now.
Yeah.
We just, as a group, actually went down to Lydia's for a lovely time and breakfast and what have you, and then we walked through the
Darryl, I'm doing all this series of breakfasts.
There was lots of lantana there, and
right, okay.
Yeah.
So, but then there's the nemesis of do you clear the lantana, and well, obviously you'd use the Brady method and hope that the native bush would come back at the same rate that you're getting rid of the.
No, that's now the trick is to provide alternatives at the same time, and do it just in little blocks, so that that's going on. So yeah, we can't. Gone are the days we just go in and rip everything out.
Yeah.
A lot of the birds just simply won't survive that. They'll if there's nowhere for them to survive in the meantime, they'll just disappear.
Would there be, Darryl? Would there be a size of how much sort of each time you regenerate? Is there a study down in that area of how much sort of the patch should be for the regeneration?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's that detailed. It would be wherever there is lots of studies along those lines.
Yeah.
But they will always be local. It'll depend on where they were done. So whatever if they've been done in northern Queensland or Perth or somewhere, it won't be applicable in Sydney. It'll be a very.
Yeah.
However, there's. Let me do a plug for a book.
Yeah.
It's just called Habitat. That's what it's called. Wait a minute, I'll see if I can find it here in one of my books.
That is really great information. Yeah.
Oh, here it is. Yeah. So the author is A.B. Bishop. Habitat, a practical guide to creating wildlife-friendly Australian gardens. A couple of years old now, but it's good for everywhere in Australia, and it gives you the resources. One of the things they say is you've got to find the plants that occur naturally in your area. They'll be used to the conditions, they'll used to the climate, used to the soil. They will grow better than something that you've bought in from Western Australia or something. So it encourages that, and it shows you how to recreate bird habitat in your backyard in the best way possible. It's a really good little book. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. And also, Yeah, our local environmental group called WIRES is talking about a concept of, because we're thinking about what we're going to do on this patch of land if it's handed over to the community because it's Crown land at the moment. And the WIRES was talking about to have like a little shed set up to nurse the injured birds, the small injured bush birds in the area, and release them. Would that be a good idea? Or could that be a potential, is there any negatives on that or problems? Should be
all that's happening all the
mindful.
time. I mean, there are WIRES type groups all over Australia that assist with injured birds and release them once they're okay. That goes on all the time. Well, are you suggesting that they could be used to repopulate some of the areas?
No, actually, what they're mainly talking about is to have a kind of almost like a place to nurse those birds, which they are just about to be rehabilitated. That's last stage before they've been released to the wild.
That happens all the time. That's a common thing that's going on, and it's well structured. Those people are doing a great job. Yep, sure.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Okay, Christine, I might call you in on this. There's a question I have on the spread of fructivores, or the reintroduction, if you like, of fructivores up from the north down through Sydney and down into the south coast. I've often blamed Lantana for the spread of white-headed pigeons, but probably privet as well. But it's interesting to notice that, for example, in Sydney, there's a massive expansion of the Australian fig bird that was not here before. They're currently in the centre of the shopping centre here in Engadine, for example. And is this a change of gardening practice, or is it birds utilising the weed spread? Christine, you would have noticed a lot of it on the North Coast, wouldn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I know it's mostly about weeds, the weeds. Some will just be the natural spread that there's a lot of birds are spreading as the climate changes. They're just spreading naturally. But now the weeds are driving a lot of those movements, without a doubt. And the fig birds can eat all sorts of things. They're not just eating figs. They eat all sorts of small fruit, and they spread stuff around. So so that's what it'll be, almost certainly. Yeah.
And also, like now in that area next door, I noticed that there are, apart from our small birds, some of these like sulphur-crested cockatoos, butcher birds, wattle birds, all sorts of birds are now there. Could there be a kind of a conflict between these birds, or that's not something that we should intervene?
No. Well, we've completely disrupted everything. We've disconnected all the connections in an ecosystem. A proper ecosystem is a billion trillion little connections between all the species and all that. We've tossed that aside, made a completely artificial, strange environment called the city, and some birds are coming in, And the problem is it's never going to settle down, because the thing that humans always do is want change continuously. So instead of allowing the new, strange environment to settle and make the connections with each other and all the species getting on, we are continuously changing things, changing the plants, digging out this, taking that away, chopping down that tree, so that the birds that live there, any of the animals that live there, are having to cope with constant change. So it's going to be a long time before the city ecosystem stabilizes, and that's it's not probably never going to happen. And the only birds that will be able to cope with that will be the ones that can cope with change. But they're there. We just need to give it time and not be so interested in changing everything all the time.
John.
Yeah, okay, Brian. G'day, Darryl. I listen to you on the radio all the time. I enjoy your talks. So I'm in Newcastle in Hunter Valley. I'm in a large block in a 120-year-old place, And over 35 years, I've progressively gotten rid of all the exotics and changed my property to mainly natives, and I don't do any maintenance because the yard looks after itself. And I was intending to, and I had a lot of Indian miners, which I was intending to try to trap, but I didn't get around to it. And from what you've said, I'm glad I didn't bother, didn't waste my time. But for the last 10 years at least, maybe 15, I mean, I've got a lot of noisy miners as well as a lot of the larger birds, and I've tried to create shrub layers, but I'm in the city, so I haven't got many passerines. But I haven't got any Indian miners now, none whatsoever. They're all noisy miners, and so I don't have to worry about the Indian miners. But I wonder, do you think perhaps it's just trying to create that native habitat that might have encouraged the noisy miners and the other native birds that are here and excluded the Indian miners?
Yes, that's almost certainly what's happened. It's a good story. I mean, the noisy miners are a problem of their own, but at least they're our problem. They're natives, So and you now know that if you have the right structure of the forest, you can have the little birds as well. But so wherever there's kind of an even competition between noisy miners and common or Indian miners, the noises always win. They always win. So that's just seems to be a progressive, steady, natural process that seems to be going on now. Yeah.
Better the devil you know, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well,
it's really strange. One of the things I had to get used to was out in the streets here around Kuala Lumpur, where I'm living now, there are 4 or 5 species of miner. And I just went, oh no, wait a minute, they're supposed to be here.
Yes.
It was a bit like New Zealand coming to Australia and thinking, bloody possums. No, actually the possums.
Exactly, yes.
So there are 4, I can literally look out my window there and there are 4 species of miners there.
Darryl, I'm going to ask a question about that. What's the most common one there? Is it the common miner or is it the white-vented miner?
No, it's the commonest bird here. It's not the common miner.
Is the white-vented?
No, it's the Javan.
The Javan miner?
Javan miner, yeah. It's a dark grey one. It's a small one. But we've got commons, we've got Javans, we've got crested, and we've got great, all here, just in the streets. Yeah.
You'll just have to go up and see the hill miners instead.
Yeah, no, the hill. I don't have to go far to see hill miners. They're just up in the roadside. The reason that we live right here is because although my wife has to further to commute to the university, I can walk out in 5 minutes. I'm in the rainforest. I won that battle.
Darryl, speaking of miners, I spoke about that influx that I had in the valley where I live of bellbirds, and then they went. And I've also had an influx several years ago of the noisy miners, and they're no longer around. What drives the noisy miners on? Is there anything? Or
I've no idea. I've no idea. They wax and wane. It really does change. Okay. There'll be some fine aspect of the environment, the flowering patterns or something that's driving that, but I really don't know. Yeah. But that's the normal thing. They do wax and wane and change and come back and all that sort of thing. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Darryl, I've got a very peculiar question. We've got kookaburras, and there was a baby kookaburra which couldn't laugh properly. He sounded like a little dog, first of all, and forever he's gone now. But he just never managed to get round to laughing properly. It was very strange. It took a long time. He's either done it and gone off, or he hasn't survived. I'm thinking, is he going to survive if he can't make the proper noises?
You'll need to be able to laugh properly in order to, be accepted by another group or find a mate. That's for sure.
But
he might have been a slow developer. I don't know.
You might have had a cleft palate.
Like with the young male grey butcher birds, they take something like 2.5 years to properly learn the song that they need to sing. And you can see they're famous because you can sometimes hear, and I've seen this lots of times, you hear this funny chirping noise, and you find up in the back of a tree somewhere a young male grey going, no one's watching, How does he do it? How do you do it? You know, practicing, you know, very quietly, making sure that no one can hear them. You know, and that's called sub song, you know, and they need to do it to practice. Yeah. Yeah.
Very interesting.
Any last questions?
Look, I don't have a I can't think of a great question, Brian, but I'm curious about honey eaters, and I know what you've talked about with your work on magpies, Darryl, but with honey eaters and the amount of grevilleas that people plant in their gardens for great reasons, is it beneficial to the population? Is it just supplementing their food resources? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Doesn't matter. Does it matter or not?
Grevilleas?
Yeah.
I mean the density of nectar-bearing plants? Is that your
Yeah. Well, grevilleas and other nectarous species.
No, it turns out not to be a good idea. We've made a really artificial rich source of food that only a small number of birds which have antisocial behavior have taken advantage of. So we need less. We need less flowers and we need more plants as such, just plants. So this goes contrary to what the breeders are doing, the nurserymen are doing. They're breeding now grevilleas that flower all year round with 3 times as much nectar and bigger flowers. I mean, it's wonderful. That's what people like to see, but it's been catastrophic in terms of the impact of birds on birds. So we need to sort of cut that back, you know, sort of dial it back, have plenty of grevilleas, but not so many flowers. So we need, and they're being bred. They're being bred. We're just not hearing about them. A grevillea that's a dense shrub that has less flowers. Now that doesn't sound like the sort of thing that people would want to buy, but that's what the birds need. So we need bird-specific breeding to be going on.
Yeah, that's what I thought you'd say. I've planted some rainforest grevilleas that are pollinated by insects.
Good, great. Yeah, so that's the other thing is that crucial, that seems, that you don't expect to hear about from, at least for gardeners. We need plants that have insects on them, because that's the missing group, the little insect birds.
Yeah.
We need to put in a shrub that has grubs on it. That's exactly what the little birds need. Yeah. That's not what people are thinking about. It's always flowers. We need plants that attract the insects, especially the moths and butterflies.
Yeah, but what if you have some, like for example, 28 spotted ladybirds? Would that be something that I shouldn't be killing and I should leave them on, because they're killing some of the native plants?
But a proper population, a proper ecosystem is where everything's eating everything else. I mean, that's all good thing. That's a great thing. If there's enough of them and they're all healthy, there'll be plenty of other ones to take their place when they get eaten. So that's what we're trying to recreate. Yeah, we're suffering from a terrible level of hubris. We think we're so clever, and yet we've really disconnected so many things, and we're trying to bring it back. And we just need to admit our ignorance and our, we think we're something separate to nature. We're just part of nature. We have to admit that, come to grips with that, realize that's the case, and then we might get somewhere. But as long as we think that we're superior to nature, we're never going to get anywhere.
And Darryl, with that message, I think we might call it quits. It's absolutely the perfect way to end. I thank you very much, and I hope everybody seems pretty content with what you've just said. Next month, before we leave, we have Mr. Dave Noble in the bottom corner in my screen, who will be returning to our screens. He's been out in the field today and yesterday, I believe, taking photos for our presentation, spending a lot of time photographing fairly early fruiting fungi. And if you haven't seen Dave's photographs of fungus, you are missing a treat. You thought his photos of peregrine falcons were good. Wait till you see his fungi photos. Yes. So this time, in a month's time, here we are again. Thank you all. Thank you, everybody. And Ian, we can turn off the recording.
Okay. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks, guys. Wonderful to talk to you. Great.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Darryl.
Darryl.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Brian.
And enjoy your 5 years of bird watching in KL or across the entire peninsula.
Mm.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Thank you. Great. See you.
See you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good night, all.
Bye.